Hello and welcome. I would like to make my own video presentation of a presentation that I gave just actually 3 days ago in Germany at a medical conference that I was kindly invited to from a few medical colleagues in Germany. I literally have arrived back last night from the conference in Germany, and while it's, I suppose, recent in my mind, I'd like to make a recording. Obviously, it won't be the same kind of ambience from being on a stage with a large salon to a more casual reading here, but I would like to make it available for a wider audience. So this was a kind of alternative medical conference with many themes, and I was asked to speak by my colleagues on this theme of the psychosis of the modern world. So I titled it The Wounded Mind, the Psychosis of the Modern World. And I started with a quote from the English philosopher Paul Brunton, and he said, "The real tragedy of our time lies not so much in the unprecedented external events themselves as in the unprecedented ethical destitution and spiritual infirmity which they glaringly reveal." And I thought that was appropriate because it's relevant to what I'm expressing in this talk. And of course, the quote is over 70 years ago when that was published, and it's still so prescient, what he was saying. So I started with the idea of consensus reality meltdown because in late 2019, I was asked by a journal to give my predictions for the next year, for 2020. And in early December 2019, I said I felt that 2020 would show a consensus reality meltdown, in that our institutions of that kind of create the dominant narrative of how we perceive the world, the institutions that we put our trust to, our knowledge power institutions, we're all going to start kind of breaking down and dissolving, as if our external structures no longer could perform their function. They're becoming dysfunctional. And in that would then see a kind of breakdown into diverse ways of people seeing reality, and how they relate to the external world, and because of that, how they relate to each other. And it could be more a breakdown in our social relations. And that was, I suppose, quite prescient, considering it was, I wrote it before the impact of the year 2020. But of course, I quote here Professor Matthijs Desmet, the clinical psychologist from Belgium, and he has said, well, there already existed in our societies before 2020 a widespread psychological suffering, a lack of meaning, and diminished social ties. So that's in keeping with my prognosis, and I'll come back to Matthijs Desmet later. And I'd like to show here a short clip from an online open source video which has been very popular online. It was published about 5 years ago by Lubomir Arsov, called In Shadow. And as you can see, it starts off by showing people have a hole inside of them, an internal lack. And immediately it shows them kind of exteriorizing themselves to their technology, their devices. And this exteriorization creates a social mask for them, a persona. And through this persona, they interact with their external world. But of course, it's also very limited, very restrictive, including the desensitization through the video games and violence. It shows them being part of the glamour industry, the consumerism, commercialization. Also shows them being something very toxic, this black smoke coming from them, their shadow. And inside their mask, they're broken. And, they're smiling on the outside, and they're trying to externalize their well-being. But of course, it's coming from an internal lack and a kind of sense of being broken. So I was saying here that there's an inner lack is often compensated by an externalization, being pulled out into a kind of shared traumatic experience. And here I also mentioned a good example of this is the Blue Whale Challenge. And this was a online social media phenomenon that started in 2016, and it has results all around the world in many, many different diverse countries and cultural backgrounds. And this challenge was that when a young person signed up, because they all were young, but when a person signed up, and predominantly teenagers, they were given a 50-day challenge, and they were given an administrator to give them challenges over the 50 days. And if they completed these challenges, they would rise up the kind of ranking board, and so give them notoriety. The early challenges were very innocuous and innocent, such as watch this horror film or do this activity. And then they became increasingly disturbing, such as then asking people to self-harm themselves and to send in an image to show that they had self-harmed. And people were then, of course, sharing in their traumatic experiences and wanting to gain infamy through this. And the peak of the 50-day challenge, the ultimate challenge, was the ultimate act. It was to commit suicide, perhaps the ultimate act of both harm and nihilism. And many people, several people did do this. Many people, in fact, tried it, and they would give an image of the blue whale logo before trying to commit suicide and jump out of windows, etc. Many bodies were found, but of course, the official status is that they died of suicide, whether it was the blue whale challenge or not. So I think what we're seeing here in society in the last few years is an increase in what are known as the group B personality disorders, such as the borderline personality disorder, the antisocial personality, narcissistic personality, and histrionic personality. Now, for borderline personality disorder, we have such aspects as the splitting syndrome or dichotomous thinking, where again people engage in polarized thinking. You either it's my truth or not. It's it's me or you. It's left or right. It's black or white. And again, this is creating a lot of social dysfunction and splitting because of this binary polarized thinking. I'm right, you are not. Also, such things as obsessive attention seeking, narcissism. We know this through a lot of online behavior, people wanting to get on viral videos, YouTubers and Instagram influencers. Obsessive attention seeking by taking selfies also, and we know that taking selfies can be dangerous. In 2014, the US Department of Transportation recorded over 30,000 injuries from people taking selfies while driving. So they named 2014 the year of the selfie. And since then, tens of people die each year from taking selfies, whether they fall off high buildings or they get run over by trains by taking selfies before an oncoming train. So actually, taking selfies is not an evolutionary advantage. Emotional instability, what they call mood dysregulation. According to Michel Serres and his research, there was a media study, and they looked at all the language used in media, both online and offline, and legacy traditional media, and they found that the most often repeated word is the word death. Also, they calculated that by the time a young child reaches the age of 12, they would have witnessed around 20,000 murders. Of course, these murders are in films, movies, television, video games. You could say it's not real, but of course we know that some of these depictions are very graphic and horrific, and having limbs cut off and tortured, and people engaging in murder on video games adds to a certain state of desensitization. A lack of perceptual clarity is an aspect, what they call impaired reality testing. Well, we know that there's a lack of perceptual clarity with this rise of pseudo-reality and deep fakes and post-truth. We're not sure what is true anymore because replicant truths can be substituted. In fact, in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary stated that 2016 was the word of the year was post-truth. So obviously we're having a lot of acceleration in that area there, leading to empathy dysfunction. Another aspect is antisocial personal disorder. We've seen a lot of this both online with bullying and trolling, but also mostly offline, protesting, violence in streets, random acts of violence, and especially in America, we've seen random aggressions and gun violence, which I think is the epitome of antisocial disorder, and having no kind of conscience or self-perception of how this behavior negatively affects others. Narcissistic personality disorder, a lot of people having fantasies about the power that comes from their beliefs and thinking that their beliefs are more special than others and more important. And of course, the gestures that they make, they do it specifically so they can be on image or be recorded. So it, again, can go viral. It's usually a large visual, a large symbolic gesture in order to feed their wish or narcissistic fantasies about power. And so you've got such examples of, doing a high-profile event such as throwing soup over national monuments or pieces of art and wanting to be praised and admired for that. And again, histrionic, similar, seeking attention, but also coming out dramatically and strongly with strong opinions that actually have few facts or details to back them up, and therefore easily led in this way by information and other people. And often this lack of information is because either that they've taken some theme or some subject without doing correct or proper in-depth research over the theme. It just sounds good at a surface level. Also because they have given information specifically by the organization and the group that they belong to or align with, and this group tailors and customizes information only to represent their agenda. And so from this, of course, they have an emotional relationship with their opinions. So I ask here whether we're suffering from a collective psychic epidemic, what I call the normalization of delusion. If a friendly extraterrestrial were passing this planet and decided to stay a while and do some social anthropology, they may come to the conclusion that humanity on this planet is suffering a collective psychic epidemic. And also because we may not notice it because it becomes normalized through our institutions. The madness of the world appears to be a normal feature of our human civilization because certain traits and aspects have been normalized in our cultural social institutions. Knowledge and power gets institutionalized, as the French theorist Michel Foucault rightly said in the 1970s and onwards through his research. Knowledge over the body, for example, came through the institutions of the asylum, and then through the hospitals, and then, of course, later into the medical industries, and now into stronger factions and institutionalized medical organizations and industries that represent that. Knowledge and power over the mind was through education and educational structures, and then, of course, into the social conditioning of institutions, political and legal. So, of course, if that knowledge and power then starts to belong to a dysfunctional institutional system, then that dysfunction trickles down into the societies and again becomes normalized. The old mind, or the wounded mind as I call it, which increasingly has an impoverished view of life, still becomes institutionalized. And we can say that now they're also crossing over. So knowledge and power over the body has become now governed more and more by political structures. And the political system has they're having legal rights over how they represent and dictate certain forms of power over the body. So we could say that this knowledge of the body and biology is becoming biopolitics, which then, of course, becomes biosecurity because of the way they enforce their political regulations over the body. And Also biocapitalism, how certain institutions of technology and finance also get invested in power over the body. So we have biocapitalism also. And centuries ago, in the old form of knowledge and power over the body, for example, it was very crude. If you had went against the sovereign king or queen or the state, they'd probably put you in a town square and probably punish you or humiliate you, or to the extreme, they may hang you or execute you to show power over your body publicly. Of course, most Western governments can't really publicly hang people, although they may wish to. And I thought I'd put a quote there from the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing: insanity, well, that's just a perfectly rational adjustment to an insane world. Similarly, the spiritual philosopher Krishnamurti famously said, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So going on about the knowledge and power in our institutions, and especially in our political institutions, the Polish psychiatrist Andrzej Lebowski made a study of this, which he called political ponerology, about political power. Of course, power is only as effective as the wisdom of the people who hold that power. And according to Andrzej Lebowski, a lot of people who are in positions of high power are manifesting aspects of psychopathology. He says here, a quote, if an individual in a position of political power is a psychopath, he or she can create an epidemic of psychopathology in people who are not essentially psychopathic. Again, if this dysfunctional way of behavior is institutionalized, such as aspects of psychopathology, then that starts to get trickled down in society because it gets represented as something which is normalized. And I think we can perhaps see how that's worked in some of our more current and incumbent political systems, how behaviors, we may say that's dysfunctional thinking and behavior, but incredibly it's widespread in a lot of political systems. Similarly, the sociologist Kyriakos Markides has said, the social world we collectively create will reflect the pathology that lies within ourselves. Of course, what we imbibe, we also reflect, because society is it's a communal participatory phenomenon. And so what trickles down to us and what becomes part of our human conditioning, we then reflect it out. And if we have that pathology, we will reflect it in how we behave in our societies. I know that in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher famously stated that there's no such thing as society, only a collection of individuals. But then again, Margaret Thatcher said many things which people didn't agree with. So going on from there, going to the idea of the mental intoxication. I say that thought forms are just as contagious as any biological virus. Now, biological virus can spread through liquids and fluids, or through the air even, and through contact. But of course, thought forms, a person can put an idea or thought online, and instantaneously they place that. Anyone else around the world, opposite side of the globe, can receive that thought form and be affected by it. So it's instantaneous that they can be contagious. And so, and if there's certain thought forms dominant in society, they can form mental intoxication. And Matthijs Desmet, the professor in clinical psychology in Ghent in Belgium, has become quite popular in the last few years with his study of the psychology of totalitarianism. And he said that he's seen, what he sees is a growing form of mass formation, or the formation of mass psychosis in our, especially largely Western societies, because of certain factors are eminent. And these factors are, one, a lack of social bonds, a breakdown in these communal social bonds. And we've seen that a lot because people are moving more and more online. In the last few years, of course, we had this social distancing. And people may feel that just because they have 1,000 or several thousand fans on on Facebook or followers, or even some high-ranking people may feel they have hundreds of thousands of followers on their social media. It doesn't make them genuine social bonds. I'm sorry. People experiencing life as meaningless or senseless. Again, because of this breakdown in our reality constructs and consensus reality, we don't know what is true anymore. What is, what we can't even know what we're being told has any truth to it. And so increasingly we've been distancing from any form of sense or meaning external to us. And if we have an inner lack, we again have nothing to anchor ourselves to. So people experiencing more nihilism, a sense of meaninglessness and no future. And of course, as Bob Dylan famously sang a few decades ago, there's something going on, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? We don't know what's going on. There's too much uncertainty, and that creates a lack of sense within some people. Point number 3, free-floating anxiety. Again, because we're anxious, we have stress, but we're not sure what's going on. So where do we place our stress? It's free-floating. But then it makes us, because it's free-floating, it makes us more vulnerable to transfer the anxiety onto something, onto some object or event. So if there's an event out there, such as a pandemic or a geopolitical event, such as a war, we can transfer our anxiety onto that. But then again, depending on those dominant narrative structures, which are controlling the narrative around that event, we can get affected by those narrative structures, what we are told, because our anxiety is invested in those events. And number 4, free-floating frustration and aggression. Again, this angst just becomes a kind of randomness, and we've seen that again in random acts of violence. So it can be such simple things as road rage, or just losing it with our friends or work colleagues. In fact, I just saw a report come out in the media the other day saying that rage makes people more productive at work, so we should release our inner Hulk. I mean, I find that very, very distasteful. Just because some study or pseudo-expert have found that productivity can be increased by some form of rage, of course, this is only for certain types of environments, then people should be encouraged to release their inner Hulk, their inner rage. Why? To make them more productive. I mean, it's just looking at people as economic units. So I want to look now at certain traditions that have recognized this mental intoxication in specifically the Western social cultural mindset. I want to begin by looking at Wetiko. Now, Wetiko, the term has become quite popular in the last few years, and it was originally popularized by a book from the Native American activist and scholar Jack Forbes, and he published his book in 1978 called Columbus and Other Cannibals. And he was saying that the European settlers, when they came over to the Americas, brought with them a certain mindset, and it was an alien mindset to the Native Americans, and they realized something very corrosive and toxic about it. And predominantly it was based on this sense of hierarchical structure, and the more complex society became, the more rigid that this structure became, and incorporated everybody in it, and people would be consumed by it and converted by it and normalized by it, even if they weren't particularly conscious or aware of that. He has a quote here: "Human beings have suffered from a plague, a disease worse than leprosy, a sickness worse than malaria, a malady much more terrible than smallpox. Whatever we call it, this disease, this Wetiko, this cannibal psychosis, is the greatest epidemic sickness known to man." And he was saying that, especially now in modern times, this Wetiko is still predominant because it infects people and people propagate it without maybe understanding it. He said a very simple example of this is people who may commit atrocities or may commit certain acts of aggression or violence but because it's part of their job. They're being told to do it. How many times have we heard the phrase, I was just doing my job? I was told to do that. Some of the, in the 20th century, some of the greatest atrocities have been committed by people who said, well, I was just doing what I was told. The philosopher Hannah Arendt has called this phenomenon the banality of evil. Great evil has been committed by banal people by saying, I was just doing my job. And this has also been shown by the well-known experiments by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s and 70s, what he called obedience to authority, where very well-meaning and innocent people would allow themselves to give increasingly what they thought were increasingly harmful electric shocks to other people that they couldn't see in the other room, just because they were told to do that by a person in a lab coat, a scientific coat. So again, we give away our authority by having obedience to authority. And we may even commit acts that are quite unforgiven and that we wouldn't normally commit, but we do it because we are told to do it. This is the Wetiko thinking. Also, the Wetiko thinking where people would not go out their way to help other people because they want to stay in the system, the Wetiko system. How many times have we asked someone to do a favor or to be flexible and they say, no, it's more than my job's worth? Or these days they may say, well, let me check. Sorry, computer says no. So again, we're in these structures of these thinking patterns, which can be quite corrosive. Another example, a quick one, looking at Don Juan and Central American shamanism. From a symbolic point of view, we can say that Don Juan was talking about, in order to be a spiritual warrior, to develop and strengthen our inner sovereignty and our inner kind of independent being, we had to break away from the mind, the social mind, the mind exterior to us, which is controlling us and conditioning us, and what he called in this context the predator's mind. He says here, quoting from his 1999 book, The Active Side of Infinity, Don Juan says, in order to keep us obedient, meek and weak, the predators engage themselves in a stupendous maneuver. Stupendous, of course, from the point of view of a fighting strategist. A horrendous maneuver from the point of view of those who suffer it. They gave us their mind. Do you hear me? The predators give us their mind, which becomes our mind. Again, just an extract saying there that how without knowing about it, people are very likely to be living through a predator's mind, a mind that we've been given through our conditioning and which we take to be our mind, but actually it's not. It's a foreign, alien mind, has become our dominant persona and social mask. Look here at Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner, who 100 years ago in the 1920s was talking about the possibility that our social, cultural and spiritual evolution may be blocked by certain forces, especially forces that are pushing towards deeper materialism and wanting to push us away from a trajectory of evolution that we should be going down, but towards a stunted evolution. Rudolf Steiner said that if these were certain aspects were dominant, then we have been socially, culturally and spiritually diverted, blocked and perhaps manipulated. These aspects, he said, would be a materialistic, mechanical conception of the universe, a rational, materialistic-based scientific dogma, i.e. scientific materialism, an economic view of social dynamics and systems. Economics is what drives society. It's what important is in society. It's how we value society through an economic viewpoint. The strong feature of nationalism and national identities, the popularism of separatist party politics, religious fundamentalism and dogma, and the dominance of an arid, dry, intellectual culture. Well, I'll leave you to yourselves to consider whether you feel that those aspects are dominant in our current form of life and civilization. I think we can clearly say yes there. And so this is actually shown us that perhaps we are being manipulated or diverted or blocked through a more natural social, cultural, spiritual evolution by forces wanting to push us in an unnatural way, which is deeper materialism. And I'll speak in a minute about where that deeper materialism will take us. And on the final tradition, I looked at Eastern Orthodox Church because they have an understanding of what they call logismos, or logismoi in plural, about thought forms which can be imprinted on the mind. Now, they don't say thoughts, they say thought forms. These are collective forms which can be imprinted on the mind, and specifically they look at these as negative logismois, destructive mental viruses, which take over our thinking and from their point of view, our spiritual condition, by 5 stages in their evolution. 1, assault. They assault us from outside. Then 2, we interact with these thought forms. By interacting with them, we may then give our consent, stage 3. Once we give our consent, then we are captivated them. And the final point 5, which you may not see here, is passion. They become our passions, our behavior, our driving forces. So again, even this ancient tradition has understood that humanity and human civilization is open and vulnerable to the hijacking, the assault of our thinking, of our spiritual condition through negative, destructive mental viruses. And they come externally to assault us. So there I've looked at 4 particular traditions: the Native American tradition of Wetiko, the Central American shamanic tradition and the predator's mind, Rudolf Steiner, which is European theosophy or anthroposophy, and finally the Orthodox Church, looking at the notion of mental intoxication. So this mental intoxication is what I've called the wounded mind. And what I mean by that specifically is that the wounded mind is a perception of living separate lives, or rather materialistic reality of separation. We are alienated from the world around us. We are increasingly separated. And when we're separated, we are targeted by external impacts. These may be thought forms or propaganda. We're also we receive these external impacts through our lifestyles, through our dietary and medical situations, also from the environment and what may be put into the environment to affect us. So we're receiving these external impacts which are all the time, I feel, trying to push us into a state, a human condition of increased separation and alienation from the larger world. Alienation from other people around us, the world around us, and the larger cosmological context. And this alienation is increasingly forcing a sense of meaningless and nihilism upon us. Now, Dr. Ian McGilchrist recently said that our state of the world is a kind of deluded world. And he's looked at specifically the interaction of the left and right hemisphere of the human mind. And he has documented how, the left and right hemispheres, they work together all the time. It's just that there's certain dominance. And the dominance for a long time and for many, perhaps centuries, has been the dominance of the left brain, which is looking at specifics, looking at details, being brought into rationalization and not connecting the greater dots, not seeing the bigger picture. And this has brought us to a point of deep materialism and deep rationalistic societies. It's brought it to a point of where we're now going through cultural censorship. We can't not allowed to say certain things. Everything is being pinpointed but separated into categories. We're living in deep compartmentalization, both of our social, cultural, lifestyle, compartmentalization of our thinking patterns, and of the spirit and of our inner lives. Interestingly, the great 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead has said that civilization flourishes until it starts to analyze itself. Again, when it gets down to the smaller aspects and doesn't understand the greater context. I call this the bullfighter effect. And this video I have here, a short video showing that, of again, the bull. In the bullfight, the bull is going towards the red cape of the matador. It's a red cape which pulls in the whole attention of the bull. There's my running bull there. You think, why doesn't the bull just like go around the back of the matador, try to go around and find other ways? But no, it's always focusing on the red cape. And I feel that that's also the same in our societies. Our external structures, our propaganda, our dominant narratives are trying to get people focused on the cape, on some minute details, whether it's a war over here, an event over here, something over here. And that's also what I see as the magician's trick. It's like the magician on the stage. When they do the trick, they pull out the white rabbit from the hat. We're looking at the white rabbit, we don't see the greater context of what the hidden hand is doing. And because of that compartmentalization of our perceptions, it's dividing people. We are arguing against each other. Again, back to the polarity mindset, the binary thinking, I'm right, you're wrong. It's this focus on something so specific, we're unable to perceive how this may fit into a more holistic, contextual environment. And I put a cute little line in the corner there to remind me to tell you the story about a lion. And the story is called The Essential. It goes like this. A lion was captured and taken to an encampment of captivity. And when the lion first arrived, he noticed that the encampment was full of lions. Lions who had been there a long, long time. Some lions had been there all their lives and were born in captivity. And he noticed that the lions were all involved in some form of activity. Some were being in social cultural activities, some were involved in political activities, some were involved in religious activities, some in revolutionary activities. And some lions were fighting other revolutionary lions. And some revolutionary lions were fighting and killing the camp guards, who would then just be replaced, and the whole thing continues. And then the newcomer realized that there was a lion who wasn't getting involved in all these activities, just quietly on his own. And some of the other lions were dismissive of this other lion, saying, no, that lion's crazy, that lion's mad, that lion's a conspiracy theorist lion, don't bother with him. But the newcomer was intrigued, and he went over to the other lion and said, are you not getting involved in these activities like all the other lions? And the other lion said, no. Don't you get involved with those activities. Don't get it distracted. Don't get distracted from what is the essential. And what is the essential? Asked the newcomer. The essential, said the lion, is to observe the nature of the fence. To know that you are in an encampment. If you don't perceive the fence, you don't know that you are in an entrapment. If you don't recognize or perceive you are in an entrapment, you never consider ways to get out of the fence, to break out. And of course, if there is a fence, then that also means that there's something beyond the fence. There's something beyond the current entrapment. And of course, part of that entrapment is what I call the danger of dataism. That data is becoming an entrapment. Our technological infrastructures are becoming increasingly like a glass cage that we don't notice because we don't see this encampment, this entrapment. But of course, if we ask everybody we know to say, if you go online and do a search engine for a similar term, people would get different responses from their search engines because the data around us is customized according to our preferences, our behavior, our previous data. We're living in increasingly restricted and customized technological bubbles, and increasingly more data is being collected on us and collected on the world around us, and that becomes a worldview, seeing the world as data or economic units of value. And we can see that in the work of Professor Shoshana Zuboff in Surveillance Capitalism. And one quote here from the technological magazine Wired in their definition of data. They said, dataism is an emerging market that worships data rather than gods or humans. According to dataism, human experiences are not sacred, and humans are merely tools for the creating the internet of all things. According to dataism, the entire human species is a single data processing system with individual humans serving as its chips. Not very comforting, I would say, as a worldview. not humanistic at all, and quite an alien way of thinking, I would say. And that kind of aligns with what's been said recently by the well-known Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, who's said quite infamously that perhaps the biggest issue that will face people in the future is that people will find themselves becoming irrelevant, and that a new underclass of irrelevant and useless people will arise. Of course, that's only from a certain perception, from the perception perhaps of dataism, of a technological infrastructure, or of technocracy. And it's what I call the extension of a machinic consciousness. We had the first and second industrial revolutions coming out the 18th, 19th centuries. Then around the 1970s, we had the third industrial revolution with the rise of desktop computerization. And now certain organizations are trying to promote that we're moving into a fourth industrial revolution. But of course, this is the paradigm that is extending the machinic consciousness. And I would say that it's not an evolutionary pathway. It's exactly what Rudolf Steiner said 100 years ago, that this extent of materialization shows that our social, cultural, spiritual evolution is being blocked and hijacked to go down a different trajectory. I refer here to the work of the Russian-American sociologist Pitirim Sorokin. And Sorokin actually established the sociological department at Harvard University in the early 20th to mid-20th century. And he said that he did a large study of the phases of societies and social evolution. And he said that societies can be recognized according to their cultural mentality, and that they go through phases, almost like a pendulum. They swing from extremes, from one extreme to the other, but as they do, they move through a third phase in the middle. And on one side, you have what he calls ideational, where reality is primarily considered as spiritual and immaterial, what I would call a sacred order. It may be abstract and symbolic. People may not know, they may have faith without a specific of that faith. They just have faith on something larger than themselves, of a cosmological order. And we've seen that, for example, in the Middle Ages. And then the other extreme is the sensate, where truth is seen as material and to be gained through materiality, what I call the empirical order. But also, Sorokin says that he calls it the sensate because it also becomes hedonistic, that people live through their senses and their sensual desires because they kind of embed themselves in deep materialistic practices, and a sense of satisfaction or a sense of meaning comes through engagement with materialistic practices only, and so they are generally through the senses and sensuality and desires. But a swing away from one of those states comes to the idealistic, which is a synthesis of the two. We may call that a conscious material development within a sacred order. And Sorokin said that as of like the 60s and that onwards, he felt that society was moving away from the sensate, the deep materialism, into more of this synthesis, into understanding that we have material development, but it's also within the context of a larger sacred order. But of course, what we're seeing so far is that we haven't come into that sacred order yet. It seems that there are forces which are trying to push to sustain this sensate materialistic paradigm, this cultural state and mentality. And then the further they push towards this deepened extreme materialism, then they are kind of blocking this natural cultural swing, this natural order. And it's kind of having this dysfunction, this contestation of forces, because we're not allowed to bring in the contact or the connection with this larger sacred order, because we've been increasingly pushed as a society and as a civilization towards to remain not only within the empirical order and the order of the senses and sensual desires, but increasingly in that state, which is more increasingly of an aberration. So what we really need, of course, we should be going through a phase change right now, what I would call using the term metanoia. Metanoia coming from the Greek metanoin, meta meaning beyond, and noin nous, beyond thinking. We need to go beyond our thinking to get out of this artificial push towards keeping in extreme materialism. But of course, we're not sure where we're going because, as they say, did the philosophy of the fish ever help it to become an amphibian? We may not know the state of consciousness or the consciousness structures of where we're going to. But of course, if we align with an organic, natural trajectory, we'll be taken that way. We may not know where we're going, but if we are synchronizing and resonating with a natural swing, a natural kind of evolutionary trajectory, then we'll come into organically the thinking patterns and the state and the human condition and the spiritual condition that we'll need to be in. But in order to do that, we have to be able to be flexible and to shift our consciousness and thinking patterns by embracing thoughts beyond our present limitations and current thought patterns, and not to be increasingly restricted and increasingly compartmentalized and separated by these kind of dataism, economic unit thinking structures. And what we need is to embrace that radical view, a radical change of our worldview, to have reasons for meaning in the world, to have meaning of why we are alive, and to have meaning in something beyond ourselves, and to connect with something beyond ourselves. And I referred to these before in my work as the C values, or in English they are called C values because all the words begin with C. And on one side we have what I call the service to self, these values of competition, control, conflict, censorship. They're all very restricted, they're all very inward. The competition, the control, the conflict, it's all me, hashtag me. Whereas the other values, the service to others, connection, communication, consciousness, compassion, they're all outflowing values. Connection, communication, compassion, consciousness, they're all to others. They're not about ourselves. And these are the values I feel we need to go through in order to swing towards Sorokin called the state where we understand that we are within a larger sacred order. But right now, we can look at the world around us. I think you'll agree that we see these service to self values being held onto, invested in, and obviously there are these institutional structures which are becoming increasingly dysfunctional, are afraid to let go of these values because that's where they maintain their status of power and knowledge. But of course they are corrupting that, and it's becoming increasingly dysfunctional and toxic. So finally, to heal this wounded mind, to heal this psychosis, what is the real transhuman? Again, trans is Latin, similar to the Greek meta, meaning beyond. What is beyond human? Well, it's not the transhumanism that we've been propagandized with. There is a tech elite or a tech cult, which is talking about transhumanism of being embedded and augmented through our technologies, and finally perhaps to upload our consciousness to the cloud. This type of extreme augmentation connection with a technological infrastructure, and that technological infrastructure is of course becoming increasingly technocratic. But you see, I feel that actually this transhumanism, this false pseudo transhumanism, this tech one, it really is a cult. In fact, even 10-15 years ago, I was researching transhumanist movements, and 20-15 years ago, sociology, and these were fringe movements. These were people talking about, they were almost kind of like biotech hackers. They were talking about, connecting themselves to devices for bottom-up purposes, and looking at technology. But they were a fringe group. But recently, what's happened, of course, is that a certain strata, a tech elite strata, which is a combination between financial tech structures and the large technological corporations, have combined together to promote this theme together. And because they more or less own the media, they have a large platform to promote this form of transhumanism. So it seems widespread. Everyone's talking about this techno-transhumanism, but really it's only being promoted by a very, very small crowd. It's just that they have a large platform, well funded, and control most of our mainstream media, so they are able to promote it. And they promote it by making it seem inevitable. But it's not inevitable. We're being force-fed the false program that it's inevitable, but it's not. So what I feel is the real transhuman is the necessity to gain a sense of meaning, purpose and connection with our physical reality, but importantly as well as beyond it, the larger sphere. Because our evolving mind behaves within a collective ecology, not in a binary relationship, not through polarity structures, not through compartmentalization, not through division, but the evolving mind behaves as a collective ecology. Now, to relate to something beyond ourselves, it doesn't have to be religious or spiritual. We can relate to our larger human community, we can relate to Mother Earth and the planet, we can relate to an intelligent cosmos or the larger cosmological evolution. So it can be spiritual, it can be metaphysical, but it's however we wish to gain a greater context for our perception and worldview that gives us meaning in our current lives. Because again, an evolving human, an evolving mind is a relational human. Relationships are primary. How we relate to the things around us, and again, not to be restricted and compartmentalized by this increasingly cult of technology that's been hijacked. And I say a balance of outsourcing and insourcing. We outsource to institutions that we feel have meaning for us, but we insource our sense of meaning and our distinction of what is working for us and what is correct through insourcing with our inner state of awareness and intuition. And so to finalize, my final phrase would be that the evolving human, which includes the evolving mind, requires a transcendental connection. Something larger than ourselves that gives us meaning, that feeds our inner condition. We need to realize that we are part of this larger picture and that we are connected fundamentally with something transcendental. And we should not allow these corrupt, toxic structures to break down and hijack that transcendental connection. So thank you for listening to me and for listening to this talk. Cheers.